Hello, everyone. Welcome to the first panel of the day. So this is a policy-focused panel. Thank you so much, Michael, for that introduction and for organizing this event today. As mentioned, my name is Kristen Csenkey, and I am a postdoctoral fellow at St. Francis Xavier University in Nova Scotia. I'm also the lead on two SSHRC-funded projects focused first on the geopolitics of quantum-safe algorithms, and the second project is focused on responsible quantum technology governance. If you're interested in any of those projects and contributing to them, please come up to me after. I'd be happy to chat about it. So just for everyone's awareness, we're still at 3 medals at the Olympics for Canada, and if that changes during the panel, please let me know. So here today on this panel, we have 3 esteemed colleagues. First, we have Tracy Forrest, who is the research director at the Center for International Governance Innovation, CIGI. We also have Matthew Mota, who is with the Canadian Shield Institute and formerly CIGI. And we have Kyle Briggs, who is the entrepreneur in residence at the University of Ottawa. So the sort of plan for today, I think, will be if you'd like to come up and give your opening remarks, perhaps around 5 to 10 minutes for each panelist, and then we'll go into questions, and I can open up the floor for a Q&A after. So Tracy, would you like to go ahead first?
Sure, thanks, Kristen. And delighted to be here. I want to thank Michael for organizing this timely event and for bringing this community together, and for the previous speakers who teed this panel up so nicely. Thank you, both of you. So in my role at CIGI, I work at advancing research at the interface of transformative technologies that includes quantum and international governance. And prior to my role at CIGI, I worked at the University of Waterloo, where I was part of the leadership of one of those SITREP programs that Michael referred to, the Transformative Quantum Technologies program. So I had a bit of hands-on experience in developing and delivering quantum technologies. To open, I would say that quantum technology's potential makes it both a national strategic asset for security and economic advantage, but also a source of international systemic risk if we think of quantum, of course, and also AI-enabled cyber attacks, and quantum in terms of the vulnerable supply chain. And we've heard already that quantum is a quintessentially dual-use technology, and of course that has to factor into our strategic decision-making. We think of quantum as playing 3 roles in society. That is as quantum for prosperity, or the quantum opportunity story. So this is when you think of quantum and the promise of quantum bringing that new paradigm for computation, solving previously intractable problems, etc. But also as a source of a threat, right? If we think of quantum as breaking today's encryption, and also, of course, if our adversaries gain frontier capabilities ahead of us. And then also quantum as a mitigator. So here we can imagine, quantum safe communication, so post-quantum cryptography, but also quantum as an effect deterrence. So today I want to just raise 3 areas that I feel are critically important given their profound security implications. The first is technological sovereignty and a responsible quantum development, with a particular focus on this facet of dual use and the concept of open. Also, I'm going to look at quantum supply chain and trade measures, and quantum and cybersecurity. And in my remarks, I'm really just looking to raise what I feel are important questions for us to think about. So the first deals with Canada's role in leading or partnering to achieve collective technological sovereignty and responsible development objectives, right? So the question is, how do we align incentives and investment in Canada to increase our dual-use technology readiness and responsible innovation? This is a key question. Of course, some quantum technologies are still emerging, and so we need to enable innovation. We need to, and to do that, we need to focus on collaboration. And here's where harmonizing among allies to do that is important, as we heard earlier. We also heard earlier some of the multilateral entities that are engaged in advancing this dialogue. So that would be there's two G7 working groups, one that came out of the G7 Kananaskis Common Vision for the Future of Quantum Technologies, and also one that is central bank and finance led. You also have the NATO one, as we've heard of, Transatlantic Quantum Alliance, a multilateral quantum dialogue. So all these entities, how do they work to help support this harmonized approach, right? There's things like integrating IP policies, coordinating around economic statecraft, recognizing that a call for responsible quantum technology really is a shared global endeavor. And how can we? What is the role of international standards? What is that role for security sufficient openness? So in a recent brief, Moritz Kopp and I, previously of Stanford, wrote, we explored this is a mechanism to strengthen the foundations, supporting objectives, including a coordinated PQC migration. Of course, we also heard that standards can be fraught, and so we also need to be careful. We need to pay attention to the integrity of that standardization framework itself, and we need to ensure it's robust and follows well-established rules, and no one actor is in a position to manipulate. And given that quantum is still emerging in some cases, it's not immune to the so-called pacing challenge or the Calling Ridge dilemma, which you may have heard of. So pacing challenge just being, technology moves at the speed of ideas or relevance, as we've heard, and policy works at the speed of bureaucracy or government. And so these things can be mismatched at times. Calling Ridge dilemma simply is, technology at its earlier nascent stage, you might not have all the applications in mind, but it's maybe easier to govern, whereas where technology is more advanced, the applications are clear, but it's more entrenched and more potentially difficult to steer in terms of governance. The piece here that's important is to think about the rapid increase in defense expenditure. We're going to need to spend some time thinking about what does dual use mean, right? There's a lot of different definitions around dual use. This is a current area of active research at CIGI, where we've gone back and with my colleague, Professor Barry Sanders, and a previous co-op, Sabrina Chen, looked at a sort of a holistic conceptualization of dual use, going back into history and the civil military framing, civilian military framing, to legitimate illegitimate framing, to benevolent malevolent framing. And then, of course, in the recent evolution, you would see that even within the civilian military framing, you have a new piece that's brought in, which is around a commercial market strategy. Another area of emphasis is around resilience. And so what we are coming forward with is dual use as a spectrum, and looking to provide clarity in terms of where you sit as an actor. And when you think of questions, for example, some would say dual use is everything, it's omni-use, especially when you think of infrastructure. Multi-use infrastructure so you can start to color this, and you can say, okay, let's be more clear about the terms when we mean core dual use, when we mean multi-use, when we mean emerging dual use. And this has stark implications for the efficacy of public expenditure in dual use, as well as for human rights. If you look at the use of the term dual use objects in war, you would see that it's enabling of targeting. And so if you increase the scope of dual use, then you're inadvertently also increasing your targets. And that could include civilian infrastructure if you're not careful. So definitely something to be paying attention to. And at the same time, we are seeing concepts of open science and open source and open being used more broadly in commercial and geopolitical contexts. And so what does open mean? And open to who? And what infrastructure is open? You hear the notion of we need to be open as possible and closed as necessary, but practically, how do we do that? The second area I want to turn to quickly is the quantum supply chain. So this, obviously, the quantum supply chain, it's nascent, it's fragile, it's vulnerable. Many in this room would know that there's an urgent need to address critical choke points and vulnerabilities. We heard that from one of the interventions this morning. So this raises a question of how do we increase anticipatory capacity, right? How do we bring foresight to see where these choke points might be, and where do we have vulnerabilities in our supply chain? And where should Canada go alone in developing quantum technologies, specifically frontier capabilities? And where should we be investing now so that we're resilient in the future? On trade measures, there are many questions. Many of you would have noted the export control on quantum computers at 34 qubits with some level of error correction. And this came to a surprise by many in the scientific community, because there's a question of, well, why that threshold and why now? And soon after, China actually surpassed that threshold. So what was the meaning of the export control? And as export controls increasingly become more restrictive, and reach further into the emerging territory and up the supply chain, if you will. How do we do this effectively outside of Wassenaar, which is our traditional arrangement around trade controls? And so how do we do that, knowing that if we can't just go it alone, that's not effective unilateral trade controls. How do we measure the effectiveness of trade controls once they're in place? And under Carney's variable geometry paradigm, you may have heard his manifesto at Davos, are we comfortable exporting quantum technologies to countries that don't share our values and may serve as a broker to an adversary? These are really important questions, and there's questions on foreign direct investment as well. The third area I'll turn to is cyber resiliency. Our digital infrastructure is, of course, under threat by emerging technologies like AI and quantum. And because Ria's in the room, I'll just mention her work with the late Ray Laflamme and Kim Delat. And there they highlighted the need to acknowledge the urgency of PQC migration. They also referenced Moscow's model, and if migration requires 5 years and data protection is needed for at least 5 years, we need to be thinking urgently about this now, and we need to be adopting quantum safe solutions well before quantum computers become viable. We also need to think, of course, about the prioritization of sectors when we think of critical infrastructure and data. I'm now just going to say I didn't focus on quantum sensing in my remarks, but that's not to say that quantum sensing does not have important security implications. In fact, it has many important security implications. I would just point again, Ria's in the room, and there's also others that are working in, for example, quantum LiDAR. So we have a project underway looking at, for example, the security implications of quantum LiDAR in a subsea environment. And at CIGI, we work with a network of fellows and contributors, and I'm pleased to also acknowledge Michael Murphy has contributed to much of our work in this quantum security space, as a wonderful colleague. And I would just encourage you, if there's anything I've touched on here, we have a day and a half together, and I'd be pleased to pick up the conversation and share links. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Tracy. Kyle, please take it away.
Thank you. So thank you, Michael, for organizing and for the invitation. There's a couple of different intersections of my work with quantum and emerging technology generally. So I've previously founded a nanotechnology company and built that up over a few years in Canada. I've most recently been working on the SAIL initiative, which combines a streamlined framework for tech transfer to get technologies out of universities into the hands of startups. With risk-tolerant investment mechanisms in those early stages. All of this to say that my perspective coming into this is sort of grounded at the interface between academic research and first steps of commercialization. And that's sort of my role at Ottawa, is helping scientists turn their research into commercial ventures. And so when we're talking about, in particular, technology emerging from publicly funded research, which is to say low TRL scale, these technologies follow a power law distribution of value. A small minority of the technologies yield most of the value, and it's very difficult the earlier you get in the process to distinguish or to predict which one will be valuable versus one that will not. And so when we're talking about those very early technologies, and so this is more to the quantum sensing side of things in a lot of cases, it's more important to make sure you don't miss the valuable technology than it is to have each one of those individually a success. We're also obviously seeing an increased recognition of the importance of technological sovereignty, economic security, and where emerging technologies are concerned. And again, when I say emerging technologies, I'm speaking of early stage, coming out of research stage technologies. These often have the potential to be dual use, but it may not necessarily be obvious up front which ones are actually going to have dual use in the long run. And so this makes it just all the more important to be investing early in maintaining domestic control over these technologies long enough to be able to make an informed decision about them. Quantum is an interesting example in the context of Canadian emerging technology, in that where in most research commercialization pathways, and we heard it earlier, we're very good at research, not so good at commercialization. In most cases, risk intolerance on both the public and private sector side gets in the way of that approach to very early investment in these emerging technologies. But quantum is something of the exception to the rule. There's been this steady investment over a period of decades in Canada in bringing quantum technologies out of the lab and into the market. And we've actually done a pretty good job of following through. And so as a direct result, we have some of the leading quantum companies, and we're actually in a position to be able to make measured, informed, and strategic decisions about where we go from here. So that being said, I see quantum tech and quantum computing specifically as being at something of a crossroads. I think everyone in this room probably agrees it's a matter of time, when rather than if at this point. And what remains to be seen is what countries will benefit the most from it. And so it came up a little bit earlier that DARPA QBI was mentioned, where the Americans are putting pressure to try to bring quantum technologies in. China and their spending on quantum was mentioned as well. The last number I saw was I'll call it generally an educated guess from 2023 that suggested they were outspending us by about 7 to 1, which is to say we have a head start, but the next few years are going to be critical because there's huge investments going into developing this globally. And so with that in mind, there's 4 broad trends that I'm paying close attention to at this point. So at Quantum Now, actually I had the opportunity to interview a number of the Canadian quantum company leadership, including Rafael. And one of the themes that came out of those interviews was the sense that quantum computing is going to go through a period of consolidation over the next few years, where there are a few hundred quantum computing companies today. A few years from now, there might just be a handful. And that has been borne out so far with what I've seen since then. D-Wave in particular announced very specifically they were freeing up $400 million for acquisitions, and they followed through with that. And so Canada's in a position where our leading quantum companies could be consolidators rather than the consolidated. And I was very happy to see the Canadian Quantum Champions program putting funding behind this, because it is very well timed. So that's something to keep an eye on. The second trend, and this is yet to kick off, but I suspect will be soon, revolves around the application layer. So the idea here is that I think there's a parallel to be drawn between the early days of Silicon Valley and where Canada is with respect to quantum computing today. In that once the infrastructure is built, the value creation very quickly changes to building applications on top of that infrastructure. And where that value accrues depends on where the infrastructure exists to enable it to happen. You brought up a great point around the question of strategic use of open here. And I think a good example to consider in thinking about how to position this is the AMD versus NVIDIA battle that went on, where NVIDIA decisively won the AI race, not necessarily because their hardware was all that much better than NVIDIA's when ChatGPT was first released, but because they had built CUDA, this system that made it very easy to build applications on top of an NVIDIA hardware stack, where it was difficult to do it on an AMD stack. I think we're going to see something similar in the quantum computing space, where there's room to strategically use open in order to enable application development and value development on top of the infrastructure layers that come out of that. The third trend is around quantum readiness. The world is going to need to overhaul their security practices and encryption practices, ideally yesterday or several years ago. And so just like in quantum computing, Canada actually has all of the expertise, companies, the hardware, et cetera, here that the world is going to need in order to make that transition. And this is something that's going to happen ideally before quantum computing is a reality for obvious reasons. And then lastly, and to your point, there's a lot more to quantum tech than just computing, and Canada has leading roles in all of that, but the TRL and the readiness level is spread across the scale here. So we've got companies that are building, that are mapping Earth's magnetosphere to build positioning systems that are independent of GPS. There are ones that are building sensors to detect things under Arctic ice. Almost all of these have dual use potential, or are obviously dual use in some cases. And here, given the various stages of readiness and research, it's especially important to remember what made Canada successful in the quantum computing space, which is risk-tolerant, patient investment of public and private capital sustained over a long time frame, understanding that these things take quite a while to get to readiness. And so we've seen this huge pace of geopolitical change over the last few years and months even. And it's made clear that Canada has to engage in nation-building projects to advance independence and technological sovereignty. We are not big enough to excel at everything. We will have to be strategic about it. To your point about spending smarter, I think quantum is one of those strengths on which we should be building. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kyle. Matt?
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me. So I'm going to focus in a little bit also on this discussion of dual use and focusing in on quantum as an example of what dual use is. At Canadian Shield Institute, we're very focused on thinking about Canadian economic sovereignty in all forms and what that might actually mean, and also building a Canadian economy for the 21st century or for the digital age. So what kinds of interventions can we make to build on our strengths already and kind of move forward with what we have in a positive way? So I think, as Tracy mentioned already, dual use is very context specific, and thinking about what it means often is going to it's going to be defined by what our outcomes are that we want to actually get. So if we're talking about dual use, if we're talking about quantum as a dual use technology for defense and for civilian purposes, right now, and possibly in the emerging or the soon to come out defense industrial strategy, what are the outcomes that we want to derive from that? And currently, most mentions of dual use in our legislation and policy focus on, pretty much all of them focus on export controls and sort of weapons controls to some degree. And that's important. We want to continue with those commitments, but moving forward, how do we then continue to maintain those values and those commitments while also building up capacity where we want to build it up? And I think there are a few key areas that we can really focus on moving forward in terms of policy to prioritize, especially in a fairly still emerging, I guess, it's a debatable question, but emerging, but also fairly well-developed technology. We have areas of quantum that Canada really leads on. So building on that, I think, is going to take a very specific set of steps. And it's hard to talk about this to some degree with the defense industrial strategy not out yet. So, we're all sort of speculating. I hope a lot of it, and I get the sense that a lot of it will be addressed in that document. but there are areas that can't only be addressed by a single policy as well. So I think one of the main areas that I've found looking at multiple jurisdictions and just thinking about dual use across a number of different areas, and thinking about in Canada, if we want to have these capacities very urgently, we likely will not have a company that will be able to supply that, as people have said in the past. And so it's going to be extremely essential to partner with Canadian companies early on, long before those needs emerge. So figuring out where the areas that are most strategically important are going to be, partnering early on and building those capacities. If we need something, yesterday, obviously we need to buy it from whoever can supply it. But if we continue a cycle of needing it yesterday and then asking for it, we're going to always be looking for off-the-shelf options that are never going to be Canadian options, or very rarely, unless you have some sort of confluence of opportunity and the right kind of companies that are there. So I think that's a really essential point. I think it's also really important, and I don't think I need to convince people in this room, but building on our strengths is extremely important. We have excellent research, deep research within institutions. We have really strong resource economy, and that can grow. And we have really great, in quantum specifically, infrastructure that we can build on. We at Canadian Shield, others, I think, rightly advocate for adding value in the Canadian economy. We don't want to be the old sort of saying, we don't want to be the hewers of wood, drawers of water. Sometimes it's fine to be the hewers of wood and drawers of water if it's a strategic area. So if we become not only this, but if we become a space where other companies and other countries are relying on us for our quantum research infrastructure, that is a choke point, that is a essential element of the ecosystem that we can leverage for other purposes. In terms of investing in resources, that is extremely important. And we also need to continue to invest in our deep research, even though commercialization is so important, and operationalizing existing technologies in specific domains is going to be extremely important. And a great historical example of this is Canada's nuclear research through the NRC. We were sort of part of the Manhattan Project peripherally, especially on the energy side, and our ability to supply uranium allowed us to be a lot closer to continued work on nuclear energy than I think maybe a country of our size at that time would have warranted in other cases. And so we were, the hewers of uranium, but that allowed us to continue to have really excellent nuclear research for a long time. It's not the only factor, but it's one factor. And that's, I think, nuclear is a success story for Canada in terms of how we've taken really theoretical, deep research in government-owned labs primarily into commercialization and into leading on the world stage in key areas. The other element here, and colleagues here have talked about it a little bit as well, thinking about how we bet on winners and picking key areas where we can combine technologies or areas of technology where we can focus in on with investment, like sensors, for example. Canada's got some really great companies doing work on that. Picking the right winners, picking them early, but also picking domains that we can lead on, space and quantum, things like this. Maybe it's very general like that, but things also that are unique to our geography, like, Arctic related and just adverse environment research that feeds into quantum research and other deep tech research in general. These kind of specific directed, action-oriented projects and investments, I think, can be really great for transforming deep research into commercializable products, but also, defense solutions. But I think it's also essential, and again, I don't think anyone here is going to disagree with this, but I think there is a potential to overinvest in those elements and sort of forget about the research. And so we want to make sure that we still have space to do deep, open-ended research. People often talk about Borealis being like the DARPA of Canada. I don't think it will be, and it shouldn't be. And we also can't have that. We don't have the circumstances that we had when DARPA was created. We're not the United States in the Cold War. but I think we can build on our strengths to have something that serves our needs even better than that. And so this kind of open-ended research where you have 50 different projects that might go nowhere, we obviously can't have that, but having some space for open-ended research and foundational research while also having these very targeted projects that lead towards specific outcomes that we need, I think is going to be essential. Another really core element that I think is going to be essential for all of this, and I think it's been touched on a little bit, is making sure that we both protect and mobilize the intangible assets that are produced from this. So that's data, and that's also IP. So figuring out ways to better retain the IP in Canada through incentives, through, there's all kinds of different methods that we can talk more about. And then also making that IP, where appropriate, available to other Canadian companies or Canadian ministries and areas of the government and so on. So creating more robust and larger, innovation asset banks or innovation asset collectives, these sorts of things, I think is going to be really, really important, because data and IP is going to be the space where a lot of this dual use technology ends up being controlled or not controlled. And we've seen that happen in other technologies where we haven't been so proactive on that. So I think it's going to be essential. I think that is something that government is very aware of, and I hear a lot of people talking about it. It's something that we need to move very quickly on. And then the final thing I'll say, and this is not a plug for me and Tracy necessarily, but I think all three of us across here, organizations like ours, I think can play an important role, rather than expecting only government to do all of the coordinating, but thinking about how to, and CIDP, you're doing a great job of this as well, working on bringing people from across the ecosystem and from across different perspectives to coordinate our interests and our efforts. We are a big country. We punch way above our weight in terms of research and innovation. We still have limited resources and limited people. And so if we can coordinate who is approaching these issues and how a little bit better, I think that's going to be essential. And that's one thing I've heard a lot, is that, two people will be working on a similar thing and they've never talked, whether that's in government or elsewhere. And some of the greatest successes in government over the last couple of years have been consolidating, like, Microsoft contracts, for example, into one contract, like things like that, just bringing things into one single area, and making sure that people are able to use their efforts economically and in a way that's very beneficial. I think those are going to be essential elements for thinking about quantum and for thinking about dual use tech in general.
Thank you so much, everyone, for your opening comments. I think that's really set the tone for the conversation today. So I have a number of questions, generally for the panel and specifically for you as well, and then we can open it up to questions from the audience. The first question is very general, and anyone, please feel free to jump in with your response. The first question is really, how can defense policy adapt for this need to deepen cooperation between Canada and traditional partners, non-traditional new partners, while still being mindful of some of the security considerations that I think we've touched on in the opening remarks? Kyle?
I can jump in on there. Thanks. I think from where I sit in the process of turning research into impact, the key point was something I touched on very briefly in the opening remarks, which is that when we are doing all of this research, when we have all of these research outputs, the intellectual property coming out of these research outputs, it is not going to be obvious at the outset which of those are relevant to defense. It's not going to be obvious which of those are going to have value in the long term, whether they have defense applications or not. And so when we're talking about IP retention, I have seen firsthand that a huge amount of what comes out of the research is gone before it ever gets a chance at commercial relevance. Like, it doesn't even make it to a startup stage. It collects dust on the shelf or it's gone right out. And so a lot of the work that I'm doing right now is around finding novel ways to fund that sort of pre-revenue commercialization gap, the valley of death, as it's so often called. Previously, and until fairly recently, it was unusual for anybody to make the direct connection between getting that portion of the pipeline right and defense. I think that's changing. And I think there is now a recognition that technological sovereignty and defense coming out of or securing the results of research involves more than just securing the research itself. It involves investing then in what is the next step? How do we bring that forward to a point where it actually creates societal value, economic value, defensive value? And so there's the transition point, I would say, between the idea of picking winners, which is to say you have these well-established companies that are obviously doing excellent work that need to be supported. And then there is the much earlier stage where it doesn't make sense to pick winners, and it really is a question of investing broadly and making sure we keep control of IP and keep control of these technologies long enough to make an informed decision about the defensive implications, because otherwise they're gone before we have that option.
Sure. I would just highlight the opportunity around making the defense specifications more transparent to early innovators, so that they have a target in mind. And I mean, when I worked at Transformative Quantum Technologies, often we were connecting with early adopters, right? And that could be a pathologist at Sunnybrook. It could be, in fact, it was the Defense Logistics Agency in the United States, right? They're like, how do we do this better? Because our folks, they're going to Amazon and they're getting their logistics supply. Like, what is the promise of computing for us? And so I think if we can expose, and I know that that's part of the remit of some of these new entities that are being envisioned here, is to expose some of those security requirements early to early innovators. That could be really enabling. And also, even within not just Canada, but think of NATO, right? NATO also has this challenge of, each of the members of the 32-member alliance, they all want to see their industries thrive within their domestic territory. And so, yes, we want interoperability, but we also want to position our technology for our company and our technology for an advantage. And so, this is just my own thinking of we do have technologies today that are privacy preserving. We do have, we can spend some more time. I spoke to someone during the break about, thinking about data custody, and that's so important, right? Just thinking about intellectual property. If we just we have to think about are the provisions around our data and our intellectual property, and we should be able to go into these discussions in a more transparent way, but noting that we can still protect our secrets. There's technology that can be enabling there, and so I see a lot of opportunity to unlock here. Matt?
Yeah, I think I agree with all those points. I think I would just add that I think research security is extremely important, but thinking about research security across the whole ecosystem, so thinking about it a lot more broadly, thinking about knowledge security and what that means. I also think building up strategic mutual dependencies with partners can be valuable to make sure that we rely on each other. Obviously, we are living in a time, and we probably were always living in a time to a degree. It was just easier to maybe ignore this, but we're living in a time where values can't really be the basis of these kinds of relationships in the same way. And so finding ways to convert our values into strategic relationships that serve what we think Canada wants and what our priorities are, while also building up dependencies between us and other nations to make sure that we can rely on each other when needed. But I think, we're going to need to be very protective about IP and data long term. And I think we've lost a lot more IP from just it leaving, just because, by no illegal means at all, than through theft. So we have to really think about that, even with partners, and what that means, and how we do that, and be a little bit more bold about the kinds of requirements we attach to government funding, so that we're investing and not subsidizing.
I
Thank you all for that. So I have a question that's mostly focused, I think, on sort of shifting to the societal perspective. So we increasingly hear that this whole of society approach is needed to ensure a strategic advantage for Canada in all domains. What does this mean in actuality to you? Like, what does this look like, and how would we get there, or should we use that approach, that whole of society approach in this context? I know, Cal, you're talking about, having this this issue with giving IP away, and how can we bring that whole of society perspective to this mix, and not just putting it in conversation with the defense perspective as well.
So that's a great question, and I think part of the framing about how we've been thinking about this in the context of what we're building now is that Canadians should see a benefit from investment of their tax dollars within their lifetime, right? If we're going to spend on research, there should be an impact that comes back. There should be a benefit coming back to the people who fund that research, right? Which is the taxpayers. This has been an ongoing debate around tech transfer and licensing with universities, for example. The argument from the university side being, well, we supported all of this research, we should benefit from commercialization of the research. The counterpoint being, well, no, taxpayers paid for that research, and taxpayers should benefit from the results of that research, right? I think there's maybe a bit of a jadedness that I've seen among some Canadians around the idea of, why are we funding all of this research if we are not keeping control of it, or if we're not doing anything with it, right? If it dies on the vine, so to speak. And I think there's a concerted effort that needs to happen to engage Canadian society more broadly around the shifting thinking around that, because it is shifting, right? Historically, there have been some high-profile cases of Canadian technologies that were lost, that aren't benefiting Canada in the long term. And I think building back some of that confidence that this is a worthwhile investment of tax dollars, that there will be benefit from it, given the duration of time that it requires to go from a research idea to something like, quantum computing is a good example. This has been 30 years or more at this point. And, from initial investments to being on the edge now of realizing that value. And so, yes, I absolutely think there's a very important element of education and trying to be very explicit and deliberate about the steps that we are taking to make sure that public investment is translating to tangible value, even if the delay is a full generation.
I'll just a very quick remark. From the defense perspective, you would have seen with the 1.5% increase in NATO commitment that was encompassing of societal resilience so this is the notion that if we increase our ability, to be resilient of attacks, right? So that's our infrastructure. But also, I've heard that referred to as well in terms of our vulnerable communities. I think Canada's over 300 remote communities. If we think about how do we support those communities as well, and especially with most of them being in the northern regions of Canada. So that includes internet access and security of electricity infrastructure and those types of things. And then so that's on the societal resilience piece. But then there's also, we've heard this morning, like dual use being like economic prosperity, and then also, of course, defense readiness, right? And so that economic prosperity story also, for me, falls within this whole of government, and the dual use, that connotation also carries for a private actor, can carry that market strategy, right? Like I can work within, I can take my technology and I can increase my market size if I capture both markets, right? I can look at the defense market and I can look at the civilian market, and I can look at those in a strategic way in the way that I develop my technology.
Yeah, I'll just add, I guess on all of these questions, I think something that we do need to, it is being talked about a little bit, but I think what we need to think about is what are the outcomes that we want to have from this kind of investment. Do we want a ton of foreign direct investment and hope for spillover effects and kind of maybe have a Canadian Google that we can say, look, it's Canadian, even if it'll probably move to Ireland, and so that it doesn't have to pay taxes or whatever? Or do we want value to return to Canadians? I think generally that's what we want, of all kinds. So increasing our capacity to defend ourselves and our supply chains, increasing economic opportunity for ordinary people as well that maybe have nothing to do with quantum and may never use these systems at all. So thinking about and having, I think, a little bit clearer messaging on how these policies and strategies are going to feed into a long-term thinking about, like, what do we want Canada to actually look like in 10, 15, 20 years. I think that's kind of essential. So that's something that I would like to see a little bit more of, and would help us kind of cohere our approaches a little bit more, or make it a little bit clearer what the roadmap is.
I'll just add to that very briefly. The geopolitical chaos and the U.S. sort of resetting its relationships generally has created a willingness in the Canadian public to have these conversations, to think seriously about defense. Right, a few years ago, hitting NATO targets, let alone 5%, would have been untenable. Right now, there's willingness to have that conversation. It's an opportunity, right? This is an opportunity for one of these a nation-building projects around defense and technology, or the intersection of defense and technology that wasn't there a while ago. And we absolutely should not waste that opportunity to build this out.
These are excellent responses. I think maybe we can turn to questions from the audience. Maybe we can collect a few. And if you have a question, can you state your name and your affiliation, and maybe who you would like to answer the question? You can open up to the floor.